The summer of 1944 was unlike any Europe had ever witnessed. Vast armies clashed across the fields of France, Belgium, and beyond, leaving behind ruined villages, broken roads, and skies filled with the steady drone of aircraft. For the Allied troops pushing forward, every mile gained was costly, but it was also vital. Victory depended not only on strength at the front, but on the ability to sustain momentum. Into this desperate environment arrived the engineers of the U.S. Army, carrying with them the machinery and determination to reshape the very ground beneath their boots. Their mission was not to fight directly, but to make fighting possible. And they would do so in ways that astonished the continent. Imagine standing on the edge of a small European village, fields stretching out around you, quiet except for the distant rumble of artillery. Within hours, bulldozers roar into life, tearing into the earth with relentless purpose. Men in uniform move with precision, laying down steel planks across the churned soil. By morning, the once empty meadow was transformed into a runway, ready for aircraft to land, refuel, and rise again into combat. What seemed impossible only a day before now lies in plain view, shimmering under the sun as planes begin to thunder overhead. To the soldiers and civilians who watched, the transformation felt like something out of another world. The need for such speed was born from the reality of modern warfare. Unlike the trench battles of the First World War, the campaigns of 1944 demanded constant motion. The German retreat was fierce but calculated, and the Allies could not afford to pause. Traditional bases, built over months or even years, were too slow to keep pace with the rapidly changing front. Air power had become the decisive weapon, but it required proximity to the fighting. Without forward airfields, Allied troops risked losing their greatest advantage in the skies. This was the environment in which American engineers demonstrated their extraordinary skill. They carried with them not only equipment, but a philosophy of mobility. Every day lost was a risk, every delay a potential disaster. The engineers understood this with absolute clarity, and so they worked tirelessly to ensure that fighter and bomber squadrons could remain as close to the front as possible. Their task was monumental, yet their speed made it seem effortless. To those watching from the outside, it was as if the Americans were rewriting the rules of war. For many Europeans, the shock came not only from the sight of new airfields, but from the pace at which they appeared. Local farmers who had spent years working the same soil watched as entire teams of soldiers carved it into something unrecognizable overnight. What had once been farmland or pasture became the nerve center of an advancing army. The hum of engines and the clatter of steel replaced the sounds of cows and harvest. To some it was disruptive, even jarring. To others it was the first tangible sign that liberation was arriving with unstoppable force. The story of these airfields is not just one of engineering, but of vision. They symbolize the determination of the Allies to move faster than the enemy, to keep the pressure constant, and to never let the Germans regain their footing. They were more than strips of land. They were lifelines that linked the front to the skies, ensuring that the power of Allied aviation could be brought to bear at a moment's notice. The airfields were the heartbeat of a campaign that thrived on speed. Without them, the advance would have stalled, leaving troops vulnerable and progress uncertain. As the war pressed forward, the rhythm of battle began to change. Soldiers learned to expect the arrival of aircraft wherever they marched, supported by bases that had been empty fields only days before. The landscape itself seemed to bend to the will of the Allied armies, reshaped by machines and manpower into instruments of war. For many, it was a revelation, proof that America's greatest strength lay not just in its soldiers or weapons, but in its ability to transform vision into reality. The hook of this story lies here, in the awe that swept across Europe as men turned earth into airstrips and silence into thunder. In this opening chapter, the stage is set for what would become one of the most remarkable demonstrations of industrial warfare. The American engineers were not frontline heroes in the traditional sense, yet their work became a decisive factor in the outcome of battles. To understand how Europe was shocked by these feats, we must begin here, with the moment when empty ground became a lifeline, and when the Allies proved that the very pace of war could be changed by construction. This was the early context, the foundation upon which the entire story rests. The shock of American engineering achievements did not come from the sight of machinery alone, but from the glaring contrast with European methods of war. For centuries, Europe had fought its battles tied to the terrain, using fortresses, established supply lines, and bases that took months, sometimes years, to construct. Even in the Second World War, many armies still clung to the idea that military infrastructure had to be carefully rooted in place. Airfields, when they existed, were typically permanent fixtures carved slowly into the ground and anchored to long-term strategy. By comparison, what the Americans brought seemed less like construction and more like conjuring. Picture the perspective of a European officer trained in the old ways of planning. He had been taught that logistics required patience, that the building of bases demanded careful surveys, and that new runways could not simply appear overnight. Then he watches as American engineers storm a patch of farmland, bringing with them bulldozers, trucks, and entire teams of men who work in shifts without pause. The ground shakes with the rumble of heavy machines. Within hours, the field is leveled, planks are laid, and the first outlines of a runway emerge. By dawn, fighters are already landing. For that officer, the experience was bewildering, even disorienting. It was as though the very rhythm of war had shifted beneath his feet. The difference was not only practical, but philosophical. European armies still saw warfare as something tied to geography, with strongholds and defensive positions defining the limits of possibility. The Americans rejected this, embracing a mindset that war could be fluid, that terrain was not a fixed barrier, but something to be shaped and overcome. Their willingness to turn empty land into operational hubs reflected the same industrial confidence that powered their factories back home. Where others saw limits, the Americans saw opportunities to build, and to build quickly. This created a profound sense of unease among allies and adversaries alike. For civilians, too, the contrast was stunning. Farmers who had lived their whole lives within slow, seasonal cycles of planting and harvest suddenly saw an entirely new rhythm imposed upon their land. Overnight, their fields were no longer agricultural spaces, but military assets. Steel replaced soil, engines drowned out the wind, and the pace of life accelerated to match the tempo of war. To them, the change seemed almost unnatural, as though the Americans had learned to bend time itself. The old Europe of patience and permanence was colliding with a new vision of immediacy and speed. German soldiers, facing this transformation from the other side, felt the contrast as a direct threat. Their commanders relied on the assumption that the Allies would be delayed by logistics, that distance and infrastructure would slow their advance. Instead, they saw bases rise from nothing in days, bringing squadrons of fighters and bombers within striking range far sooner than anticipated. What was meant to be a buffer of time turned into a vanishing illusion. Each new airfield erased another line of defense, leaving the Germans increasingly vulnerable. The shock was not only in what the Americans built, but in how quickly the old rules of war were rendered obsolete. The Allies themselves were astonished by the pace. British and French officers who had lived through the slower tempo of earlier campaigns recognized that they were witnessing something new. While their traditions emphasized endurance and methodical preparation, the Americans introduced urgency as a weapon in itself. The contrast was stark enough to cause friction at times as different armies tried to reconcile their approaches. Yet the results could not be ignored. Every airfield built in days gave the Allies a sharper edge, and every day saved translated into pressure against the retreating enemy. Ultimately, this conflict of approaches highlighted more than a difference in engineering. It revealed a difference in worldview, in how nations thought about war and what they expected from their armies. Europe still carried the memory of wars fought with deliberate pace, anchored by tradition. The United States, by contrast, brought the force of a younger industrial nation that saw no reason to wait. In this clash of old and new, the contrast was not subtle. It was shocking, undeniable, and it reshaped the expectations of everyone who witnessed it. To understand how American troops achieved such astonishing feats, we must look back to the origins of their methods. The United States entered the Second World War with a unique advantage, one rooted in its vast industrial base. Factories that had once produced cars, tractors, and construction equipment were now redirected toward the machinery of war. This industrial strength did not only provide tanks and planes, but also the tools to build the infrastructure that kept armies moving. The bulldozers, trucks, and steel planking that poured into Europe were symbols of a nation that had learned to harness its factories as effectively as it harnessed its soldiers. The ability to create airfields in days was not improvised in the moment. It was the product of years of preparation, training, and a philosophy that prized adaptability. The engineers themselves were as carefully trained as the soldiers carrying rifles. In camps across America, they had drilled in the art of rapid construction, learning to level land, lay steel mats, and repair runways under pressure. Their training emphasized speed without sacrificing effectiveness. They were taught to work as if time itself was the enemy, because in war, every hour lost could cost lives. This mindset set them apart from more traditional engineering courses in Europe, where construction was still treated as a deliberate, methodical process. The Americans had turned engineering into a combat skill, one as vital as marksmanship or tactics. The philosophy behind this approach stemmed from a belief in mobility. American commanders understood that the battlefield of the 1940s was no longer static. Tanks and mechanized infantry could push deep into enemy territory, but without air support, their advances would falter. Aircraft needed to be close to the action, ready to strike at a moment's notice. Permanent bases far behind the lines were too slow, too distant, and too vulnerable. Thus, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was tasked not with waiting for ideal conditions, but with creating them. If no runway existed, they would make one. If the terrain was poor, they would change it. Nothing was allowed to stand in the way of momentum. Imagine the training exercises where these ideas were put into practice. Fields in the American countryside were churned into makeshift test sites. Soldiers sweated under the sun as bulldozers roared and steel planking clanged into place. They worked in teams, learning how to divide labor, how to move materials efficiently, and how to finish before nightfall. At the time, it seemed like preparation for something distant, almost theoretical. Yet when the war in Europe demanded airfield built overnight, this preparation became the key to Allied speed. The engineers were not improvising. They were executing a plan rehearsed thousands of times. This background also highlights the broader American approach to war, where industrial power was inseparable from military might. The factories at home ensured that resources flowed steadily, while the soldiers overseas turned those resources into practical advantages. Unlike countries that relied on limited stockpiles or fragile supply lines, the United States had both the tools and the confidence to think bigger and move faster. The engineers were the living link between that industrial machine and the battlefield. Every runway they built carried the echo of American assembly lines. Every steel mat a reminder that war was now fought as much with factories as with rifles. For European allies, witnessing this background unfold was both reassuring and unsettling. They admired the efficiency, the scale, and the determination. Yet it also reminded them of their own limitations, of the older methods that had defined their wars. Where they had seen barriers, the Americans saw challenges to be solved. Where they had expected delay, the Americans produced speed. This difference in origins, industrial, cultural, and strategic, was what made the Americans so startling in Europe. Their airfields were not just products of wartime necessity. They were the expression of an entire nation's philosophy of war. Ultimately, the origins of this story show that the shock of Europe was not accidental. It was the inevitable outcome of preparation, mindset, and industrial capacity. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had been built to move faster than history itself, and by 1944, their methods were fully realized. What the world witnessed in those days was the result of years of vision, a belief that in modern warfare, nothing should be allowed to stand still. The origins of the airfields tell us as much about America as they do about the war itself, for they reveal a nation determined to prove that even the ground beneath their feet could be made to serve victory. When the first of these hastily built airfields came into operation, the effect on the battlefield was immediate and unmistakable. Suddenly, Allied squadrons that had once flown from distant bases could now launch from fields barely miles behind the advancing troops. The time between spotting a German position and striking it from the air shrank dramatically. Tanks and infantry pressing forward no longer had to wait in isolation, hoping that support would arrive in time. Instead, the roar of engines overhead became a constant companion, a reminder that the skies belonged to the Allies. To the men fighting on the ground, this change meant survival, and it filled them with confidence that their advance would not be halted. For the Germans, the new airfields were a nightmare, unfolding at an impossible pace. Every time they thought they had gained breathing room, Allied aircraft appeared almost instantly, harassing convoys, striking supply lines, and hammering defensive positions. Soldiers on the move found that there was no safe retreat, no chance to reorganize without attracting the attention of fighter bombers that now seemed omnipresent. The speed of American construction meant that air power followed the front as relentlessly as the infantry did. Each fresh runway built was like a new blade pressed against the German lines, cutting off their ability to maneuver or recover. The battlefield itself became more hostile, shaped by the presence of runways where none had existed days before. Imagine being a German soldier crouched in a hedgerow, waiting for reinforcements that never arrived. The sound of engines rises in the distance, and before long bombs begin to fall with terrifying precision. To those caught beneath the raids, it must have felt as though the Americans had eyes everywhere, as if the skies themselves had turned against them. This was the psychological weight of the airfields. They erased the illusion of safety. Nowhere was beyond reach. No corner of the battlefield was free from the shadow of Allied air power. The psychological strain mounted quickly, weakening morale and forcing commanders into increasingly desperate measures. For Allied troops, the impact was the opposite. Imagine an exhausted platoon advancing through mud, weary from days of fighting. Suddenly, the roar of friendly planes fills the sky. Bombs crash into enemy positions ahead, and fighters sweep low to strafe retreating soldiers. The men on the ground cheer, their fatigue briefly forgotten. They know that their engineers have made this possible, that somewhere behind them a field has been transformed into a runway that keeps their comrades in the air. Each airfield was more than a strip of earth. It was a lifeline, a promise that the soldiers at the front would never fight alone. This bond between the ground and the air reshaped the experience of combat. The tactical consequences were profound. Battles that might have stretched into stalemates now tipped quickly in the Allies' favor. German units that tried to dig in found themselves uprooted before defenses could harden. Supply depots, hidden in forests or tucked behind hills, were discovered and destroyed almost as soon as they were established. The rapid creation of airfields meant that every German move had to be calculated under the constant threat of instant reprisal. In effect, American engineers had turned time itself into a weapon, reducing the gap between planning and execution to almost nothing. As the campaign pressed forward, the battlefield grew increasingly shaped by these dynamics. German commanders complained that their men could no longer move freely, that the speed of Allied response left them constantly exposed. Some units avoided daylight altogether, moving only under cover of night in the hope of avoiding air patrols. Even then, Allied reconnaissance from newly established airfields kept them under pressure. The Americans had not only built airstrips, they had built a system of control over the battlefield. Every new runway extended that control, and every new squadron that landed there tightened the grip. The impact on the battlefield was not only strategic, but also emotional. Soldiers remembered the sight of planes circling overhead as proof that their sacrifices were supported and that victory was within reach. Civilians under occupation witnessed the sudden appearance of Allied airfields as a sign that liberation was drawing near. The Germans, meanwhile, saw the same fields as symbols of their impending defeat, each one a reminder that their enemies could move faster and strike harder than they could resist. In this way, the airfields were more than physical structures. They were instruments of momentum, shaping the very tempo of the war. By the end of 1944, the truth was clear. The battlefield had been transformed by American engineering. What had once seemed impossible, building fully operational air bases in mere days, had become routine. The Germans were stunned, the Allies empowered, and Europe itself was learning that modern war was not bound by the old rhythms of supply and construction. The impact was everywhere, in the skies, on the ground, and in the minds of those who lived through it. The engineers had not fired the weapons, but their work ensured that the weapons struck swiftly, decisively, and without pause. The rapid construction of airfields did more than alter the immediate battlefield. It reshaped the broader course of the war across Europe. For the Allies, the new mobility meant they could apply constant pressure without pause, denying the Germans the time they desperately needed to regroup. Each airfield shortened the distance between the front and the skies, allowing bombers and fighters to reach deeper into enemy territory with less risk and greater frequency. This relentless pace slowly eroded German strength, not only in material losses, but also in their confidence to wage war effectively. The consequences rippled outward, far beyond the soldiers directly engaged in combat. For European civilians, the wider consequences were deeply personal. Villagers who once felt isolated from the main theaters of war suddenly found their landscapes transformed into hubs of military power. What had been farmland or meadows became runways, echoing with the noise of engines and the heavy tread of boots. To some, this disruption was frightening, as daily life was swallowed by the machinery of war. Yet for others, the arrival of these airfields brought a profound sense of relief. The speed with which the Americans built them seemed to promise that liberation was near, that the old order of fear and occupation was finally collapsing. Each airfield carried the weight of both destruction and hope. The German High Command quickly grasped the strategic consequences. Their carefully prepared defenses relied on the assumption that Allied forces would be slowed by the difficulty of supply and infrastructure. With every airfield completed, that assumption fell apart. German commanders found themselves forced to commit resources to defend against constant air assaults, weakening their ability to respond on the ground. Rail lines, convoys, and supply depots became targets that could be struck with little warning, cutting into the lifeblood of the German war effort. What had once been a carefully balanced system of movement and reinforcement began to crumble. Under the pressure of Allied air superiority, sustained by the relentless creation of new bases, Allied soldiers, meanwhile, experienced the consequences in a more immediate way. They moved forward with greater confidence, knowing that their efforts were reinforced by planes that would always be within reach. The knowledge that air cover was never far away lifted spirits and reduced the sense of isolation that often haunted men at the front. The psychological impact was enormous. Imagine being a soldier marching into enemy territory, exhausted and uncertain, only to hear the steady hum of friendly aircraft above. That sound was more than noise. It was reassurance that they were not alone, that the full weight of Allied power was behind them, advancing at the same speed they did. This transformation of morale was mirrored on the German side in reverse. Soldiers who once relied on surprise or swift retreat now lived under the constant fear that Allied planes would find them. Their morale suffered as each attempt to regroup or resupply met with sudden and devastating air attacks. The once proud Wehrmacht, which had dominated Europe in the early years of the war, was now on the defensive, haunted by the skies above. The psychological consequences were just as crippling as the physical losses. A war that had once seemed winnable now felt increasingly hopeless, accelerated by the Americans' ability to move their air power forward at unprecedented speed. The wider consequences also reached into Allied planning and strategy. Commanders realized that the construction of airfields had become a weapon in itself. Each new runway extended the reach of the Army, allowing more daring offensives and bolder maneuvers. Where traditional armies were constrained by the limits of distance and time, the Allies could now plan with the expectation that air support would always be close at hand. This confidence changed the nature of operations, encouraging risk where once there would have been hesitation. In a very real sense, the engineers were rewriting the playbook of modern warfare, teaching generals that logistics could be as decisive as tactics. Beyond the immediate campaigns, the creation of these airfields symbolized something larger. They were proof that the industrial age had fully fused with the art of war. No longer was conflict defined solely by bravery or battlefield maneuvers. It was now a contest of speed, resources, and the ability to adapt. Europe, with its long history of slower, methodical wars, was forced to confront this reality. The Americans had brought with them not just soldiers and weapons, but an entirely new way of fighting, one that stunned allies, broke enemies, and reshaped the continent. The consequences of that shift would linger long after the guns fell silent. The climax of this story came when the speed and scale of American airfield construction could no longer be dismissed as a curiosity. By late 1944, the Allies were pressing hard across France and into Belgium, and every mile gained was matched by the sudden rise of new runways. Entire landscapes were transformed overnight, forcing German commanders to face a reality they had never anticipated. Defensive lines, carefully planned and fortified, were rendered fragile because Allied aircraft could be brought forward almost instantly. What once took weeks of preparation was now accomplished in a matter of days, erasing the buffer of time that German strategy relied upon. The Americans had not only closed the gap between front and rear, they had made that distinction nearly meaningless. Imagine being a German officer trying to hold a position, only to learn that within days, a new airfield had appeared just behind the Allied infantry lines. Suddenly, bombers that had been out of reach were striking depots and artillery positions with precision. Supply convoys that once felt secure were now under constant attack. Each new airfield felt like a tightening noose, pulling the front closer, leaving fewer places to regroup or retreat. The psychological effect on the German army was devastating. Officers who had relied on calculated delays began to realize that the tempo of battle was no longer theirs to control. Time itself, the one resource they had counted on, was slipping away. For the Allied troops, the climax was felt in the rhythm of their advance. They no longer feared isolation, no longer wondered if air support would arrive in time. The confidence that came from knowing the engineers were always close behind fueled their determination. Soldiers often spoke of the roar of planes overhead as the sound of victory itself. Each time they moved forward, they knew that an airfield would soon rise behind them, ensuring the skies remained theirs. This certainty transformed the experience of battle. The Allied infantry and armor advanced, not with hesitation, but with assurance, buoyed by the knowledge that their momentum was unstoppable. The broader climax unfolded not in a single battle, but in the cumulative effect of this relentless progress. German strongholds that might have resisted for weeks fell in days, overwhelmed by the constant pressure from above. Rail networks collapsed under repeated bombing raids, while supply depots burned before they could be emptied. Civilians, too, witnessed the climax in their own way. Villages that had suffered under years of occupation saw American engineers arrive with their machines, turning empty ground into airfields that symbolized liberation. The transformation of land into lifelines was both practical and symbolic, proof that the Allies were not only advancing but reshaping Europe with every step. From the perspective of strategy, the climax marked the moment when old methods of warfare gave way to something entirely new. The Germans realized too late that their reliance on static defenses and calculated retreats had been shattered by the Allies' mobility. The old rhythm of war, advance, regroup, fortify, was replaced by a tempo that allowed no pause. Every German delay was answered with speed, every defense undone by airfields that rose from the soil like weapons in their own right. The contrast between the old world and the new had reached its breaking point, and the result was decisive. To those who witnessed it, the climax carried a mix of awe and disbelief. Allied soldiers marveled at how quickly their engineers could conjure airstrips from mud and grass. Civilians could scarcely comprehend how fields that had fed their families for generations could suddenly roar with aircraft in a matter of days. Even the Germans, hardened by years of war, admitted in captured reports that the American speed was beyond anything they had prepared for. This was not merely a tactical advantage, it was a transformation of war itself. The climax revealed that the Americans had redefined what was possible on the battlefield, and there was no turning back. By the time the Allies pushed deeper into Europe, the climax of this story had already rewritten the outcome of the war. The Germans were stunned into retreat. The Allies pressed forward with renewed vigor, and the landscape of Europe bore the marks of runways that had sprung up like symbols of inevitability. The turning point was clear. The Americans had shown that victory did not only belong to those who fought hardest, but also to those who built fastest. This was the moment when the shock of Europe reached its peak, when disbelief gave way to recognition that the future of warfare had arrived. As the war drew to a close, the airfields left behind by American engineers stood as silent witnesses to a transformation in warfare. They were no longer just strips of dirt and steel. They had become symbols of ingenuity, speed, and determination. Soldiers who had fought on the front lines remembered them as lifelines, places where aircraft roared into the skies to protect them in their darkest hours. Civilians recalled how fields once used for farming were suddenly filled with noise and power, signaling that liberation was near. Even in their stillness after the war, these runways carried with them the memory of urgency, the memory of how quickly the tides of war could change when vision met action. The legacy of these airfields reached far beyond the battlefields of Europe. Military planners around the world took note of what the Americans had achieved. No longer could armies rely on fixed positions or permanent bases. The lesson of 1944 was that mobility and speed could decide entire campaigns. The concept of rapid deployment, of building infrastructure in days rather than months, became a cornerstone of modern military thought. Nations studied the methods of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, seeking to adapt their own strategies to this new reality. What had once shocked Europe now became the model for how wars would be fought in the future. For the American engineers themselves, the legacy was deeply personal. They were often unsung heroes, overshadowed by the soldiers and pilots who fought directly in combat. Yet those who served in the Corps of Engineers knew that their work had turned the tide of war. Each runway they built was a victory in itself, a piece of ground that connected the front lines to the skies above. The pride they carried came not from glory on the battlefield, but from knowing that their efforts had saved countless lives and shortened the war. Their legacy was not only in the physical structures left behind, but in the very confidence of the Allied advance. In the eyes of the Germans, the legacy was one of bitter recognition. Captured documents revealed a grudging respect for the Americans' ability to adapt and build with unprecedented speed. They knew that their own systems had been outpaced, that the assumptions on which they had relied were shattered. For them, the memory of airfields rising from the soil in days was a reminder of defeat, of an enemy whose power extended beyond weapons to the very art of creation itself. The shock that had gripped Europe in 1944 never entirely faded from memory, even among those who fought against it. The wider legacy touched civilians as well. In towns and villages across Europe, people remembered the day the bulldozers arrived, the moment their fields became part of a larger struggle. For some, it meant temporary disruption. For others, it meant survival. Yet for all, It was a reminder of how quickly history could move, how swiftly the old order could give way to something new. The airfield stood as proof that liberation was not just an idea, but a physical reality, carved into the very earth where people lived and worked. Their presence, long after the war, reminded generations that freedom often came through the most unexpected means. Ultimately, the story of these airfields is a story of transformation. They were built to serve the immediate needs of war, but they also revealed a deeper truth, that the future of conflict belonged to those who could adapt quickly, move decisively, and harness the full power of industry and imagination. The Americans had shown that war could be reshaped not just with courage and weapons, but with construction and ingenuity. The legacy of their work lived on, influencing military thought and strategy for decades to come. In the end, what shocked Europe most was not simply the speed of construction, but what it represented. It was a new vision of war, one that blended industrial power with battlefield necessity. The runways carved into European soil told a story of a nation that refused to let obstacles stand in its way. They remain even now as silent echoes of an era when victory was measured not only in battles won, but in the ability to build the future faster than the enemy could imagine. That is the legacy of the airfields that stunned Europe, and it is a legacy that endures.